Right, well, welcome to G3ETH. This is the amateur side of the station. QRP-CW rig, which featured in the construction contest, used in conjunction with the Trio R600 receiver. Power supply, which is also the power supply for the TR9000. There's the semi-vintage KW2000, not in use at the moment, and the usual SWR meters and field strength meters, and that's really about all there is working in the station proper at the moment, the key of course. But the main purpose of this visit is to look at the other side of my interests, which is the vintage radio side, so we can start on that as soon as we're ready to move over to the other side of the shack. Right, well, we're not going to talk about the history of broadcasting tonight, but to concentrate on the actual items that I've got in my collection. Anyone who's interested in the history of broadcasting, etc., can always read up about it. In fact, later on I'll give you a sample of the sort of literature, the vast range of literature that's available to anyone who's interested in vintage wireless. Anyway, the first setup we have here is a range of crystal receivers, such as were used in the early 20s, in the early days of broadcasting. The sets that I have here, only one of them is an actual genuine set from the period. The others are replicas which I've made over the years to typify various types of set. Now the first one we look at is this one here in the middle, and that you can see it's in a small wooden box. That's a typical design that was made by amateurs and also made by commercial people in those days. It's essentially a variable tuning capacitor, an external coil of the sort that we usually call wild wave coils because of the sort of trademark of the Agranic company, which was "What are the wild waves saying?" And this forms a tune circuit. Of course, the aerial is brought into the terminals and the earth and the phones on the other terminals. The detector is what you would call a semi-permanent type. So it's quite a simple set. It just tuned to the broadcasting wavelengths, but it was typical of many a set that was in use at the time. Now the next one we look at is this one here, which is a rather similar set, but this is incorporates a variable inductance tuning rather than a capacitance. This knob here operates a slider which taps into the tuning coil. The tuning capacity across it is fixed, formed partly by the self-capacitance plus another small capacitor. Again, aerial and earth and phones, and covering the medium wave band, but the detector in this case is what's called a pericon detector rather than a crystal and cat's whisker type, which we'll see later. The pericon detector comprises two crystals in contact rather than a crystal to metal contact. It's built into an original box, not an original crystal set box, probably not anyway, but a box of the period, as was the first one that we looked at. Now the next set we shall look at is this fellow here, which I think you can probably see looks rather similar to this picture here, which I think is in view. This is a commercial set, and you see that this is rather similar in appearance. This is deliberate on my part. I wanted to exemplify a set of that type. Consists essentially of, again, an internal coil, variable capacitor, open type crystal detector, and also a facility for increasing the wavelength to the long waves. at this time the medium wave band was usually called the short wave band, the broadcast band, and when stations started appearing at longer wavelengths, people wanted to adapt their sets to tune into these, so they had an external loading coil which plugged into these terminals here, but if you were on the broadcast wavelength you plugged in a jumper and shorted out the loading coil terminals. These sets always had a set of instructions in the lid addressed mainly to the non-technical user, telling you things like don't use the set during a thunderstorm, and earth the aerial and so on, those sort of precautions. Right, so the next set that we come to is this, well, monster I suppose you'd call it compared with the others. This is a fairly recently made replica. It's made to a set of instructions given in a set of cigarette cards, which was issued by Godfrey Phillips in 1923, because radio was a very popular subject then, and cigarette cards were a means of putting information to thousands of people, because there was a lot of smoking going on in those days, and there were quite a number of issues covering various aspects of radio, and this is one of them. It gives you full instructions how to make your own wireless set, as it calls it. And I made this accordance with the instructions. Very large coil, 4-inch diameter, 7 inches long, with sliding taps for the aerial and for the detector, so that you could tune in and optimize the aerial matching as well as tuning into the different stations. Once you'd adjusted the coarse tuning, you got the fine tuning on this variable capacitor. The detector is a replica of an open type crystal cat's whisker detector. You can demount that and put in this other detector, which is a carborundum steel detector, but the disadvantage of that, although it was a very stable combination, was that it required an external bias voltage. And here are one or two of the sorts of things you would have to buy to get your crystal sets going. Crystals in little tin boxes, hertzite, simazite, and every other ite you can think of. They were all basically forms of galena generally, which was a lead sulfide produced under artificial manufacturing conditions. But at the end here, some genuine mined galena, which came from a mine either in Cornwall or Derbyshire, I'm not sure which. The gentleman who gave me those samples wasn't quite sure where he'd found them. So that basically is an introduction to crystal sets of the period. There is one more here that I'll just mention, because this is a genuine set of the period. It looks fairly elementary, but a lot of these things were when they were made by home constructors, and it's little more than a variable capacitor and a coil with the usual detector, which in this case is enclosed in a glass tube. It's quite crude, and it's probably not, well, we're not entirely certain that it was vintage. It might have been made at any time between 1920 and 1950, I imagine, because the coil inside is rather too modern in appearance to make it a genuine vintage set, but nevertheless it is a representative of another type of set that was used in the period. So I think that concludes the little exhibit of crystal sets. Well, we move on to 3 early valve sets round about the 1923 to 1925 period. The first one we'll concentrate on is this one here in the middle. In the early days, most sets looked rather like laboratory instruments, which is not surprising, because they started off, or wireless started off in the laboratory, and it proceeded slowly into the general the general domestic scene, and so the early sets did look somewhat laboratory-like, and this is a typical one of the period. This is a genuine set from the period about 1923, I should say. It's a two-valve set, unutilised triode RF stage into a triode detector. There's a plug-in coil, which is the aerial tuning coil, and a pair of wild wave coils in a holder which has a swinging link. This is to provide reaction as an alternative to a capacitive reaction. Inductive reaction was very popular at the time. The original wiring of this set was rather poor, so I have rewired it with square wiring, and I think it would be useful to have a look inside. If you could just bear with me a moment while I take the screws out. Right, well, we've taken the screws out, and we can lift up this panel and see what's behind it. As I say, the original wiring of this was rather tatty, so it's been rewired with square section wiring, which was typical of the wiring in use over that period. I followed the original circuit in wiring, but it's just the wiring which has been replaced. You can see the typical linear law capacitors that were used for tuning before the logarithmic type was brought into popular use. There's a rheostat in the centre for controlling the filament voltage of the detector valve. This was used as a sort of volume control and also as a means of controlling reaction. Grid leak of the usual type, and the valve holders are mounted under the panel, but of course they project through and the valves are mounted on top. I'll just let this go down now. These valves are slightly out of period, they're rather later valves, but the set works with those valves. The sort of valves you should have in this period would have the top pips on them, which I'll mention when we look at the next sets. Right, the next one we'll look at is this fellow here. Which is in fact, I suppose in a way, a kit set. It was built to a design published by the Radio Press, which I think ran Amateur Wireless at the time, and it's been assembled by a home constructor at the period. It's all very genuine and vintage. The original set, don't know whether it's possible to see from this leaflet, was in a flat form, but this constructor has put it into a sloping front cabinet, probably because it was what he had available. The valves are the typical top pip types of the period. This was the place, the seal where the vacuum was drawn off and sealed. Later on, of course, they transferred this seal to the base of the valve, so you don't get a pip on the top of the valve. It's concealed in the base. This is probably a similar circuit to the first set we saw, except that it's got a low frequency stage. These three controls here are filament rheostats to control the emission from what would originally be bright emitter valves at the time. Instead of rotating, they push in and out. And this is the tapped inductance for the coarse tuning, variable capacitor for the finer tuning. Don't worry about the noise, it's not mounted properly. This set is awaiting internal restoration. I have yet to obtain the appropriate plans. Of course, documents of that age are fairly difficult to obtain, but it is surprising what turns up. Okay, so much for the Simplicity 3, as it was called. And we'll look at this peculiar object. To look at is this. Well, the third set that we're going to look at is this tall sloping set here. Again, it's a genuine vintage piece from the period. I doubt whether the cabinet that it's in was originally intended for this set. It may have been specially made, or it may have been a cabinet off a previous set that has been pressed into service. However, it's quite an interesting set. It has the similar external swinging coils, rather similar to the set we've just looked at, and the valves mounted externally. At the time, these would probably have been bright emitters, and there are two rheostats to control the filament current. These valves are possibly bright emitters, but I'll never be able to prove that because the filaments are burnt out, as is quite usual with valves of this period. It's fairly easy to obtain valves like this for putting into units for demonstration or exhibition purposes, but it's not so easy to obtain original valves in working condition to actually make the things work. If you're prepared to pay 50, 60, £100 for a valve, well, okay, you can set yourself up, but otherwise you have to make do with dummies, and if you want to get the set going, use a later period valve, which is still vintage, but nevertheless not quite correct for this particular period. Right, well, I think that about covers these three, what I call early sets. The sets we've got on display now are of a slightly later period than the ones we just looked at. You can see that they're now in cabinets. Sets were put in cabinets from the early days of the 20s, but it was much less common, whereas later in the period, 1925 onwards, there was more of a tendency to build sets into cabinets, which could be obtained commercially, or could be made out of cabinets that were intended for other things, as you'll see when we look at this first set. Now, this set here, in fact, is a combination of a valve and a crystal receiver. It has an unneutralized triode RF stage tuned by this variable capacitor. It won't turn at the moment, it should do. And this feeds a semi-permanent type of detector. You didn't have to fiddle with the cat's whisker. The crystal was held into contact with a metal plate or a form of cat's whisker by a spring, and you could rotate it, but you didn't have to search around for a sensitive point. And in fact, this set is quite reliable in that respect. It's a very neatly constructed set for a home-built set, which it obviously is. It's been built into a case of unknown origin, rather a nice case with this bird's eye veneering on it, and it's been some sort of trophy box. I think it's had some sort of wedge in it. I don't know what it was, but anyway, it's been quite nicely adapted, and it's a very well made set. If we just turn it up slightly, you can probably look into it. I just hold the lid open. The interesting thing is the coils, which you can probably see are wound on jam jars, which is rather novel. And this jar, in fact, is an earthenware jar, which itself is somewhat of a collectible, I think. When I was restoring it, I had part of the winding off, and I think it's a Keeler's marmalade jar or something like that, but it is quite an old one. Square wiring, square section wiring, there's the semi-permanent detector, and the adjustment is this little plunger at the end, which is holds the crystal in spring contact with the metal electrode. But you don't have to fiddle about looking for a sensitive point. A rheostat to alter the filament current of the valve, which originally probably was a bright emitter. This is a later valve, and the set works quite nicely with this. You notice it has logarithmic tuning condensers. Generally, logarithmic condensers came in the mid-20s and displaced the previously used linear law condensers, which made for easier tuning of the more crowded wave bands. But that's a very well constructed set. These ebonite sub-panels are very neatly worked into the case as a whole, and unusually the soldered connections, where they have been made, are onto solder tags, which is a bit unusual for the period. There were quite a lot of rather ropey soldered connections made at the time, but generally, of course, people didn't use solder. They put loops on their wiring and clamped them onto the terminals of the components, which were invariably supplied with terminals and possibly soldering points as well, but most home constructors just use the terminals without soldering. So that's an HF detector set, and fairly unusual. Second one we'll look at is this chap here, which is a single valve set, I think. Yes, single valve set. Again with the external swinging coils for reaction and tuning, tuning by means of a variable capacitor. The usual rheostat to control the filament voltage. As I say, this was a form of volume control, or in fact a reaction control. You could set the reaction to the point of criticality, where just below the Howell threshold, and then take it slightly above and back it off for the filament control. Quite a sensitive arrangement. Looking inside, there's not a lot to see, but this time we have a linear law capacitor rather than a logarithmic. Otherwise there are no great features of interest, but it is quite a compact little homemade set, and again typical of the sort of thing that was made at the period. These things came in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and I usually look for the unusual, and this is a slightly unusual one that I managed to pick up. Now this set is again a one valve set, but it's interesting in that it incorporates a different system of reaction. It's not a swinging coil, it's what's called a variometer, and if we tip it up, you may be able to see this variometer here. If I rotate the knob, you can see that coil rotating in and out of the fixed coil, and this is the reaction winding, so providing variable inductive reaction, which is quite a smooth form of reaction, and this set again works quite well. The other interesting point about this set is these two aerial series capacitances. They're homemade. They're made by winding a spiral of wire onto a glass former, which forms a dielectric, with foil on the inside. This is rather like the Phillips trimmers that were made in the 30s, and you varied the capacitance by removing turns from the wire. So someone has had the idea at a very early date of making low value capacitances by this method. Usual grid leak, set of terminals for the LT and HT leads, which were then taken out through these holes in the back panel. Nice little oak cabinet. So cabinets came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. That I think is a professionally made one. Probably had maybe had a commercial set in it originally, although these cabinets were obtainable through adverts in the press, so no problem in getting a bit of woodwork to put your masterpiece in. The next two specimens that we're looking at here are sets with two valves. We've looked at crystal sets and one valve sets and crystal valve sets, and now we'll move on to two valve combinations. The first one we'll concentrate on is this black one here. It's in a wooden cabinet, which contrary to the general run of these cabinets has in fact been stained. Most of them are natural polished wood, or stained and polished to look more or less natural, but this one has been painted because I think it's made of soft wood, which wouldn't look very nice just as a stained and polished set. It's an interesting one in that it has this tuner, which is made by a firm called British General. Usually they made a lot of these things, and by means of a tapped coil with a switch, they could cover the whole of the wave band of interest right down from about 200 metres, the bottom end of the broadcast band, right up to about 2,500 metres, which then covered the long wave at Daventry and the Eiffel Tower and Paris and all these longer wavelength stations without having to change coils, which was probably the bugbear of some of the earlier sets that we've looked at. So this British General tuner, which we can see in more detail when we look at the inside, has the tapped inductance and a variometer for reactance, rather similar to the variometer reactance, sorry, reaction, not reactance, reaction coil that we saw on the earlier set. The tuning capacitor in parallel with this tapped inductance, in this case, is a linear law capacitance. So it's a fairly early set. This was probably made 1927 or something like that. It's difficult to judge the ages of some of these sets accurately, but I think you can do it within a few years, on the assumption that someone like me hasn't come along many years later and made up something with vintage components. But most of these have a lot of telltale signs. You can tell more or less when they were made by the wiring techniques, etc. The inevitable filament rheostat to control the filament current of the detector to assist in the reaction and the volume aspects. We'll just have a look inside this. We'll angle it slightly so we get a look in. This is the variometer, which I mentioned, or the British General tuning unit, with the variometer at the bottom end for the reaction, and you can see the action of the switch, the tapping switch for the tuning inductance. Linear variable capacitance, filament rheostat, and a compartment here for the grid bias battery. The battery is not in place at the moment, of course. The transformer in this case is of French manufacture, which is a bit unusual. There's quite a lot of imported components at the time, but most of these homemade sets used British components, but this one has got a French transformer in. Square section wiring, which is reasonably neatly done. This has been restored by me, but restoration consists only of cleaning the things up. There's never any alteration of the actual wiring, so these actual shapes are the shapes that were put in by the original constructor. We haven't previously looked at the back of one of these cabinet sets, which I think we can do at the moment. They nearly always had this very impressive row of terminals bringing in the various LT and HT voltages for the valves, and this one in fact has got an additional device here, which is a variable grid leak. A bit of a refinement and a bit of a gimmick. Didn't help a lot in the performance of the set, but nevertheless they were fitted to some sets. But you notice on the back rather than on the front, so I don't think it was regarded as any great an important feature. And look at this one, which is not in a cabinet. A lot of these sets which I obtain at auctions and flea markets and swap meets are in their original cabinets. Some come without a cabinet, which you can quite often find a suitable cabinet to fit, but this particular one has not yet found itself a cabinet. It's interesting in that it's effectively a band switching arrangement. I'll turn it round so we can look at it in detail. Each of these tuning capacitors, which are linear law, has its own tuned circuit and its own reaction coil. And one of these is labelled short and the other is labelled long, or vice versa. Short in the period prior to 1932 or so was the name which they gave to what we call the medium wave band, because of course that was a short wavelength at the time, because the rare short waves hadn't been developed for broadcast purposes, so these are labelled short and long. And this switch in the middle is effectively a band switch. Instead of just tapping a coil, you switch the whole of the tuned circuit over to get either long wave or short wave, so that's rather an unusual arrangement, but very effective, and this set works very well. A Ferranti intervalve transformer. Ferrantis were one of the major suppliers of intervalve and other types of transformers over a very long period, and so a lot of these sets you pick up have these Ferranti transformers in them. Grid leak, the usual cartridge type, and the inevitable row of terminals at the back for the power supplies. Haven't really mentioned ebonite, but nearly all these sets have got ebonite panels. Ebonite is a form of vulcanized rubber, very easy to work mechanically, easy to drill holes in, but in thin sections it does tend to crack. So a lot of these early sets with 1/8 inch panels quite often finish with cracks and bits broken off them, but this is a nice 1/4 inch panel, and it stood the test of time well. Ebonite over the years develops a sort of yellowish patina, which is due to the sulphur coming out under the action of sunlight. Now this is okay if it's uniformly done. If the thing happens to be partly in shadow, partly in sunlight over many years, you do get annoying lines and patterns on them. This is quite a good one. It's an interesting set, that, with the band switching arrangement. We'll now have a look at 5 more homemade sets. The first 2, which we've got here. And we'll start by looking at this one in the front. Slightly different shape from most of the others that you've seen. These cabinets are usually sort of wider than they're tall. Well, this is almost as tall as it's wide, not quite, but it is makes a bit of a change from the usual shape. 2 valve set with the usual variable tuning capacitor, rheostat for the filaments, and a reaction control, which we'll see how that works when we look inside the set. Now in this set the terminals are not on the rear panel, Oh yes, there are. There are terminals on the rear panel, but the aerial and headphone terminals are on the front panel and the earth terminal. Quite often they put the lot on the back, which is sometimes inconvenient. I suppose it tucks the wires out of the way, or used to do. And but this particular one has got the phones and the aerial and earth connections on the front. Looking inside, usual hinge lid. First of all, the thing to notice, I think, are these a bit steady. The valve holders, which are ceramic, which is a bit unusual. Most of the valve holders in the sets we've looked at have been some sort of ebonite or composition. Those are ceramic, and they're what you might call surface mounting valve holders. They were the sort that were usually used on the earlier types of sets, where the valves were mounted on the outside of the cabinet. I don't think there's any particular reason why they should be made of ceramic. All sorts of people made valve holders, and I think Ashley's, for instance, made quite a lot of ceramic ones. The reaction system, which you can see is again the swinging coil type. Fixed coil across the tuning capacitor. Swinging reaction coil to provide the variable reaction. Actually, it might be I'm not sure in this particular set without studying the circuit. Sometimes they put the swinging coil as the reaction coil, sometimes as the main tuning coil. It didn't really make a lot of difference, but you can see the action. You see quite a number of these sets constructed initially where it's obvious that the constructor has forgotten that when he turns the reaction down, the coil occupies quite a bit of the room inside the set, because sometimes you see signs of valve holders having been here, and of course the first time he comes to use the set he finds that the valve gets in the way of the swinging reaction, but there's plenty of room in this one for that purpose. Quite an early type of intervalve transformer, and this is a slightly later one. That's definitely out of period. Everything in this set is early 20s or mid 20s. That is definitely a 1930 plus intervalve transformer, so that's a bit out of period. Probably the original one burnt out, which was quite often the case. Very fine wires, and people were liable to put their HT to earth and put a big voltage and hence a big current through the windings of their IV transformers. So the main features of that are the ceramic valve holders, which are a bit unusual, and the swinging coil reaction, which we've seen in previous sets, but the coils at least are concealed inside the set in this case. To look at the second these three valve sets. These dials, by the way, were made by a firm called Ormond, a very famous firm who made a lot of components in the 20s and 30s. They brought out this design in about 1929, followed it a year later by a larger size, which you'll see on some of the other sets. Igranic were also famous makers of this particular sort of slow motion dial, which of course generally had the annoying habit of turning the capacitor in the opposite direction which you were turning the knob, but the better quality ones were arranged so that you turn the knob in that direction, then the dial went in that direction, but in this case these are the simpler types. Wave change switch. This is a switch coil, which you'll see in a moment. On-off switch. and let's just have a look inside, because the interesting thing about this one, I think, is the wiring. This type of insulated wire was called glazite. It was made by the London Electric Wire Company from the early 20s right up to the 1940s, I think. It was still listed in their catalogue after the war, although I doubt whether it was used very much. It was copper wire with a lapping of cotton, which was then varnished with a cellulose type varnish, and produced a very shiny surface which was generally resistant to dirt, and it could easily be stripped for connecting, because you just had to unwind the cotton, as it were. Quite often left tatty ends of cotton, but this was characteristic of that type of wire. So when you're rewiring these sets, if you have to rewire them, you must either use the same wire again, or certainly don't use PVC wire. This set has been renovated by me, but it's in the absolutely original state when it was obtained. Every piece of wire, it was stripped out, labelled, cleaned and put back. This started life in a very filthy condition, but has finished up in quite a reasonable, presentable state. The coil is a plug-in one with what we usually call a cross of Lorraine configuration of the pins. This type was used a lot of that period. Quite a good form of receptacle for the coils in use at the time. Transformers are mid-20s. That's an early BTH transformer from quite early in the 20 period. I imagine this set was made probably nearer to 1930, judging by this type of choke and the variable capacitors here, which are logarithmic law, brought out in about 1929 by Igrenic. I think those are the main features of that particular set. Well, we'll look at a couple more 3-valve sets here, of rather contrasting appearance. This one is a more conventional cabinet set, such as we've already seen. This again has the British General type tuner, covering quite a wide range from the bottom end of the medium wave band to the top end of the long wave, plus the usual reaction control. Inevitable rheostat. I think it's not stake. It's not a rheostat for the filament. It's some sort of on-off or wave change switch. We'll have a look at it when we open the lid. Variable capacitor with the standard type of Ormond dial, not slow motion, just a direct drive. Rather a pretty transfer on the lid. Someone's idea of breaking the monotony of these, the appearance of some of these sets. Opening up, rather a small aperture to look into, but I think you can probably see the tuner which we referred to earlier, and this switch appears to be, I think, without studying it further, a switch for switching out one of the valves. This was quite often done for economy reasons. If your signal was very strong, you didn't need your intermediate AF stage. You could go straight from the detector to the output stage. I fancy that's what this switch is, but I haven't really studied this set. It's a comparatively recent acquisition, and it's not been researched or renovated yet. The unusual feature about the set is the disposition of these two intervalve transformers, one at each end. I'd have to work out from the circuit wiring of why he's done that. It's most unusual to have your three valves lumped together in the middle and your intervalve transformers at either end of the set. It's rather puzzling, so it'll be interesting to look into that in due course. But it's another quirk of construction of the time, which always adds interest to the hobby, as it were. Right, pushing that slightly to one side, bringing in this peculiar beast, which again is a three-valve set, but it's a rather an earlier period, I think, than the ones we just looked at. It's more akin to the earlier sets which we saw because of this swinging coil arrangement, which has not been mounted on the side or inside, but right on the front cap panel, which must have made for rather awkward operating, but nevertheless that's how it was put together. Standard type of slow motion drive, which again goes the opposite way to which you turn the knob. Rheostats and some knife switches, which are probably for again cutting out one of the valves or switching the aerial from direct to indirect the capacitance. I can't remember on this particular set what the details are, but these knife switches were often used on front panels for various purposes. We'll just look at the back, as there's no case on this. Rather a peculiar set. I think the constructor has run out of space, because he's got this far to his terminal strip and then realised he hadn't got room for his intervalve transformer. He hadn't got room for his grid bias battery, so he's put a little outrigger on the back, or what looks like an outrigger, to get all the components in. The capacitor is that's logarithmic, so it's not too early, but generally it has the atmosphere of sort of 1927 or something like that, so it's a bit earlier than some of the other sets where we've started to look at. Still awaiting restoration, as you can probably see. The last of the three valve sets we're going to look at is rather an impressive one, as I think you agree. It's in an oak cabinet, which has an interesting feature, which I'll show you later. The set itself, the circuit, is a design published by Mullard. Mullard did quite a lot for the do-it-self market in the early period, and they published several designs of circuit, including what they call the Mullard 3-star, and this is someone's interpretation of building that set. They put it in a very nice cabinet, and in fact when I bought it, it had an original wireless receiving license in it, 10 shillings in the name of Mr. Murphy, and the guy who sold me this set claimed that Mr. Murphy made this set. Well, he probably did. It wasn't Frank Murphy of Murphy Radio fame, it was Walter George Murphy of Catford in the south of England. That's his license. The set itself, very nice ebonite panel. Been restored by me, but it's in exactly the shape and form that I found it. Every wire has been returned to its original position and shape. It's just been cleaned up, and it has cleaned up rather nicely. But this is the Mullard 3 circuit as interpreted by Mr. Murphy. Very nicely made, but the cabinet is the interesting feature. because we all thought that MFI was a fairly recent innovation, but you could get flat pack cabinets way back in the 20s. So that's one piece of it, and I assure you that the rest of it comes to pieces as well. These pieces all slide up and you're left with a flat pack cabinet. These things come off, they're pegged in. The only difference between this and MFI is that MFI is half-inch chipboard, very heavy, and this is half-inch plus oak, equally heavy, if not heavier, but certainly of better quality. The set itself is a fairly straightforward circuit detector. Two audios with quite a nice interval transformer, one of them by RI, Radio Industries, RI Valley, and the other I think by Formo. All these firms were famous in their time for producing components. This coil is of the type we've seen before, with the Cross of Lorraine type of pin configuration. Ormond variable condensers, Millard valves, and these anti-microphonic type of valve holders, which were in common use at the time, because valves were somewhat microphonic in those days, and could give problems if they came into resonance with the audio output, for instance. Rather a nice set, that, particularly as regards to the cabinet. Not having an RF stage. Now what we're going to look at now are the early sets with RF amplifier stages, which were triodes in the early days, around about 1925 up to about 1927, when the screen grid valve came into use and enabled unutilized RF stages to be used. This is a 4-valve set with an utilized triode RF stage, a detector, an AF stage, and an output stage. I call this the Bowness set because I came across it in an antique shop in Bowness, and it was quite a wreck when I got it. And when we've had a look at this in detail, we'll see if we can look at some pictures of it as it was before it was restored. These 3 dials made by Ormond date the set as around about 1927. That's when these particular dials came into being, so this wouldn't have been made before that, and this fits in about right with the type of circuit that is adopted. These are that's a rheostat for controlling the filament current, usual aerial terminals, and an on-off switch. And this is a switch for cutting out one of the audio stages, so that you could have a 3-valve set, or in fact by feeding the aerial into the detector rather than the RF stage, you could have a 2-valve set. The reason for them doing this was to save accumulator current, because the early valves took quite a heavy filament current, and so if you could do with 2 valves instead of 4, where you were receiving a local station, this was a good idea. We'll just turn this round, so as you can see the back. You can see the 3 tuning condensers, the RF stage, the detector, and a reaction condenser. The usual plug-in coils, which we've seen before, with the cross-shaped configuration of pins. Square section wiring for anti-transformer, which you get in a lot of these sets. And the output stage in this set is choke coupled to the loudspeaker, which is a great improvement on some of the earlier sets, in which the loudspeaker terminals were directly in the anode, and you had full HT on on the output terminals, which could be a bit tricky if you weren't careful. Anode resistance, the plug-in type, or rather clip-in type. That one's by Ferranti, very popular make. Compare that with the sort of half-watt resistors that we have these days, and there are a couple of glass tubular resistors there, grid leaks. This is a neutralizing condenser to provide neutralizing for the RF stage.
Replace it with
Another one, which is quite a mighty beast. Home constructors were fairly strong men in those days because these things weigh quite a bit. This is an earlier set than the one we've just looked at. It probably was made in say 1926, I should think, whereas the other one was probably about a few years later. This is very similar to a set which was called the Everyman 4, which was designed by the experts at Wireless World. It's so like it that I'm fairly sure that the constructor either based it on the Everyman 4, or possibly there was another design published prior to the Everyman 4 design, because there's an extra tune circuit in this, although it's not an extra stage. The slow motion dials are fairly early. In fact, the capacitors and slow motion dials are made by G3ETH, who not the Pi Radio, but the predecessors of Pi Radio, G3ETH Scientific Instrument Company. These two controls are rheostats to control the filament currents. We'll just turn this one round. It's quite heavy. The panel is very thick aluminium, and there's a screening section here of again very thick aluminium. This is the tune circuit of the aerial stage, and here is the the RF stage with a neutralizing condenser, slightly different type. If I tip this up, you can see probably that it's got a little dial on it. The tuning coils, the coils are plug-in types, probably with a homemade base. And probably I can't get them back. Yeah, there they are. This aerial coupling coil is that rather nice hexagonal shape. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes. Is typical of the coils made by Edison Bell. This is an Edison Bell coil, and they always finish them off nicely with this tortoise shell finish. I think they're the only people who did that, so you can always recognise one of their coils. Put it in again. These are the Pi capacitors that I mentioned. Very precision built, and very, very slow motion on them. You can hardly see the thing moving when you turn the slow motion knob. And this is the intervalve transformer, and that's the again there's a coupling choke in the output circuit, and the supply terminals on these little pillars at the back, and the aerial terminals. The capacitors are rather interesting. The fixed condensers are plug-in types. MH they say on them, which is McMichael radio, and they plug into these clips. And interestingly enough, the original bias batteries are still in place. These Siemens T cells, there's a couple of them there, and another one in the RF stage. Not many volts in them now, but they are, I'm quite sure, the original cells. These three little sliding rheostats, together with that one, control the filament currents. So that's quite a mighty engine. all the sets we've looked at so far have been TRF sets, that is straight sets. The Superhet came into being way back prior to 1920, but it only enjoyed a few years of popularity as far as the home constructor was concerned, around about between 1923 and 1926, and then it seemed to die out, probably because the screen grid valve came in and it was possible to get better amplification than previously with straight sets. But this is a Superhet, and it's unique as far as I'm concerned. It's the only home constructed Superhet that I've come across. It doesn't look very nice, but in fact there's quite a lot in it. The tuning arrangements on these dials with very tiny little viewing windows, that's a filament rheostat, and that is a switch which in fact, well, it's merely an on-off switch in this case, switches the filaments. If we lift the lid and tip the set up a little so we can have a look at it, you can see it's quite an engineering job. These are IF transformers made by a firm called Success Radio. Now, the fact that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5 IF transformers and an audio transformer, all by the same firm, and in fact the tuning capacitors are also by the same firm. I'm wondering whether it's a kit set or a design that was put forward by this firm to promote their products, but it's certainly devoted to that firm, and in fact you'll notice on the lid also is the Success logo. The case is wooden, but in fact it's lined with copper sheet. The whole lot's lined with copper sheet, and there are brass edgings, so the screening is very good, or in theory it is very good. It certainly used plenty of metal there, and there's another metal screen here. The valves are the ones that were in when I obtained it. These two here, you can't actually see them, they're top pip valves, the others are plain ones. I think in fact the valves are probably not the original ones. These are rheostats for controlling the filament current in various stages. We've got 1 or 2 of these micro plug-in capacitors and a clip-in load resistor. It's quite a mighty machine. The other thing is, although I've studied it quite a lot, I have no idea how it was put together, because you can't see any logical way of taking it apart. Normally when I renovate these things, I take everything apart and put it together in the reverse sequence. I can't really see where to start on this one, it's so complicated, so I think this will remain in its present state as a museum piece. I doubt whether it'll ever be a working model. Well, this piece of furniture is what was known in its day in the late 20s as a wireless cabinet. We used to have one at home in my parents' house. It wasn't this one. I have actually got the one that we had, but this is another one which is a slightly different style. The one we had had the set resting on the top here with the loudspeaker on top of the set. And this was a drawer which contained headphones, spare coils, etc., and the cupboard for the batteries. Well, in this this model, the cupboard for the batteries is there. There aren't any batteries in at the moment, but the set is contained in this in the top part of the bit of furniture, and it has a drop front to reveal the set proper. The loudspeaker, of course, standing on the top. Again, we've got this familiar Ormond dial, which we've seen several of. The usual filament rheostat and a combined reaction tuner, slightly different type from the ones we've seen before. This is made by a firm called Radio Instruments, RI, and then underneath we have an on-off switch. Interesting thing about that on-off switch is that it seems to be entirely homemade, although they were quite common components. The person who built this set seems to have had some mechanical ideas. This is a switch to change from radio to gram. Gramophones were in use in the 20s, and quite a number of sets had the facility of switching the gram in onto the audio stages. We'll have a look at the set. If I take the speaker off the top and take the set out of its case, we'll see what the details are. Well, it has a lift-up lid for the purpose of changing valves, not for the purpose of changing coils, because the coil unit is not a plug-in type, it's the fixed type. But if you want to change the valves or the bias batteries, then you just lift the lid. If you want to look at the set proper, the whole thing lifts out, which we shall now do with a little bit of manoeuvring. And if I place it on the top here, you've already had a good view of the front. It's a wooden panel, unusually. Most of the panels of these sets were of ebonite, but wood is perfectly acceptable. And if we turn it round, you can see this multiple tuner and variometer reaction coil. There's the variometer effect. It's not a great design in that the RF valve is over here and the tuner's over here. In fact, this will be the tune circuit for the RF stage, and this will be the tune circuit for the detector. But they are rather far apart. But however, it's quite a nicely made set. A couple of grid bias batteries went in this space here, and there's another battery here. The fact that it's well, it says Sainsbury's on it. That's because it's a replacement. It's not the original. The original battery that was in here was badly corroded, so I had to dispose of it when I reconditioned the set. So the point of interest about this is really the screen grid RF stage, which I think is the first one we've seen in the sets that I've showed you. Say the screen grid valve in that form came in around about 1927. The earlier form was a double-ended version with a 4-pin base at each end. And of course the other point of interest, as far as I'm concerned, is this bit of furniture, which, as I say, is a wireless cabinet, and there aren't really many of them still about, because they tended to be used, converted into cocktail cabinets or whatever over the years, so there aren't many of them left serving their original purpose.